Hello again, back with a further review of the RTB2004. Thought I'd take a quick look in this video at the web interface for the RTB2004 that's built into the scope. The back of the scope, as I mentioned in one of the other first reviews, has an Ethernet RJ45 connector port, and I've got this connected into a wireless Netgear access point so that I can access the scope on any of my PCs or Macs in my lab or anywhere actually that's on the same network. And what I'm looking at the moment is I've got a screen capture software. I'm running ScreenFlow on an iMac, so you're seeing a picture of my web browser, which is Safari, with the mouse pointer in the center and enlarging, and then to the bottom right hand corner you should be seeing a live view of the actual scope, so that you can actually see what's happening is virtually simultaneous on the web browser to the actual scope. So on my left here I've got instrument, home, screenshots, Skippy commands, because you can send Skippy commands via this network, save and recall, which I think is to do with waveforms, etc., network settings, changing passwords, a live screen which can be just used for a projector, say, and just gives you an image of the screen of the scope, and it changes as the scope updates, and remote front panel. If I click on remote front panel, I've gone straight into my scope, and we're now looking at, on the iMac, we're now looking at the web browser page for the scope. Now you'll also see in the bottom right hand corner hopefully a live view of the scope, and it should be doing exactly what I'm doing on this web page, and everything you can do on the scope so far I've found you can do on this software, and the software just runs straight off the scope. There's no installation, nothing to install on the computer, whether it be a Mac or a Windows machine. All you simply do is you set up your web address, your IP address if you want to, on the actual scope, or you can set it as a DHCP server if you've got that at home or in your office, lab, wherever, but I've got this set up on my network because I set my IP addresses up manually just for security. If I switch on, say for instance channel 1, you'll notice that the colours on the screen are the same as the colours on the scope for the buttons. So channel 1 is a yellow, channel 2 is a green, channel 3 is a sort of an orangey colour, channel 4 is a sort of blue colour, and you'll notice that these buttons, so in the vertical section that I'm looking at here, change with the channel selected. So if I change on to channel 2 now, I'm making all my changes for channel 2, and the buttons have gone green around the on the web browser, and they'll also go green actually on the scope, which you can probably see. They might be a little bit blown out because of the web camera I'm using. It's difficult to get a proper exposure, and I've turned those lights down as low as I can because you can actually adjust. If I go into this brightness setting over here on the right, click on that, come up, you've got your waveform intensity, you've got your grid intensity, and your LED brightness. So if I click on this, I can either double click and bring up a menu for entering my values. I can go between minimum of 20% and 100. If I click on 100, the brightness on the actual scope will have increased dramatically and probably burning out now. But if I go back to 20%, the scope will immediately alter back to 20%, and probably the best representation on the screen. But it's quite useful because if you're using the scope in a slightly darker room or slightly less well lit, you might want to put the brightness down, and to be honest with you, the 100% is just too bright. Even at 30%, 25, 30, 40% is probably bright enough. You can also adjust the brightness of the grid, and that's done by selecting grid. You can then go to this button over here on the right, and as I bring my cursor around on the outside of the button, I'm getting an arrow, as you can see, and I can increase it. You can see my scale going brighter, my grid on the scope itself, and also on the web page. I'm at 100%, I can bring that back down. That's at 35%, that's at 10%, which is barely visible. I run it normally at about 25%, something like that. Let's switch off for the moment. Let's go back out of this, and I'll show you the rest of that display in a minute. Let's go back out and switch off channels 2, 3. And now, if I want to switch off a channel, I can do it here, but I can also go down to, on the bottom of the screen here now, where I've got my channel 4 at the bottom here, and I've got the vertical sensitivity here. I can click on that, I can click on off, and that's also switched my channel 4 off. Now if I go into the generator, say, I've got a link lead linked up between my channel 1 and the generator output on the scope, just so that we can generate a signal simply just for display purposes. So I'm going to go into here, and I've got here my function generator output off. If I switch it on, I've got a rectangular wave, frequency of 1 megahertz, amplitude 1 volt peak to peak on that. And I'm on 10 to 1 here, so I'm wrong. I had this set up for the lead, so I've now had it set up for the scope probe. If I go into probe, I can now go 1 to 1, because obviously I'm using a cable and it should just purely be 1 to 1 rated. I'm not going to get a particularly good signal here because I'm just using a very cheap bit of coax, so it's not a particularly good waveform. It's purely just to show you this while we're just going through the example. If I go back to the brightness, say for instance, for the waveform that I showed you before, double click on that, it brings up my intensities menu, and that brings up the top one is my waveform, so I can also adjust. I'm not sure if I showed that previously on a video. I can adjust my waveform intensity. I can either click on that and bring up a waveform menu, which I can reposition on the screen for the brightness, going from minimum 0% all the way up to 100%. I think on 0 it will make the waveform disappear, or virtually you've just got an image of it there. Click on that again. I can put in my percentage, so it tells me my minimum and max. I can go straight to 100%. If I wanted, say for instance 80% or 75, say 75, click enter, and I've now entered 75% brightness for the waveform. That was the grid, as I said before, and those are the LED brightnesses. When I go back one menu, I'm actually going into my display menu for my persistence, so I can set up my persistence time, and here I've either got it off, so I don't have to have any persistence on the waveform at all, manual, where I can set up how many milliseconds the persistence will be. I've got it set here 300 milliseconds, or I can, sorry, go back to click on that, I can go to infinite, so that I've got infinite persistence. I've also got options, if we go back to say manual, I normally like to keep it something like 300 milliseconds roughly. I've also got my dots display, so I can go on to dot mode, and you can see the dot mode here. I can also go on to inverse brightness, and that's showing now, it's inversing the waveform, so the only things that are showing now is the things that happen most frequently are shown as a very light waveform, and things that happen less frequently are shown as a darker waveform, so it's the reverse of the normal, which is why the top of the waveform, which is obviously on the screen for a shorter period, is less bright, so it's brighter than these which are on obviously for a shorter time period, because obviously we're looking at the horizontal time period. So this vertical slope is only going to be a few nanoseconds, the rise time maybe 20-30 nanoseconds, but the top here is obviously going to be, that's one division, so we're sort of running 450 nanoseconds there, so that's why that's brighter than the vertical one. I can inverse the brightness and switch that off again. Grid. Now, grid is actually quite useful. It allows me to display a different type of reticular pattern. So I've got my full lines, which I'm on at the moment. I can go to no reticular tool other than just my crosshairs. Let's just click out of that and you'll see. So I've now got the vertical crosshair in the center and the horizontal crosshair. I've still got my volts divisions on the vertical here, which I really like, and also my time divisions along the horizontal at the bottom here. If I go back to that setting again, which was in there, got to go back one menu, go back to grid, I can then switch it off completely, and now I've got basically a completely clear display where all I'm seeing is my waveform, and it switches off my volts vertically and my time base horizontally. Don't particularly like that. One thing I do like on this scope is I actually like to see the time base, particularly horizontally, and actually the volts vertically. I just think it's an easier way of adjusting things. So I click on that menu again, bring that back, go into grid, set that back to lines. The annotation is actually the volts and the time, so you can actually switch that on and off, and it's showing you up here in this display that that's just a clean grid. Now when I switch that annotation on, I've got my time there and my volts vertically, which I leave on all the time. And I tend to leave it set up on lines with annotation on. Tracking the grid is to do with the waveform that will actually stick with the grid as you move it, which is quite useful, and I'll show you at some point in the future on one future video, particularly useful if you're doing protocol work where you want to move a waveform but track it to a cell on the grid so you can see the time base, which I'll go into in a bit more detail in due course. Coming back into that menu, back into this display persistence menu we looked at before, the persistence mode has quite a wide range of time bases, so when you click on that again you can set your persistence from a minimum of 50 milliseconds all the way up to 12.8 seconds, which is quite something, but you can set it to whatever you want. So if I wanted to set it to 200 milliseconds, I just do that and I've clicked on it and now I'm at 200 milliseconds. If I wanted to set that to 1 second, I'd go 1 and I think just enter and I'm at 1 second. I can also of course alter that on my knob as well, on the knob on the screen. So if I go on the screen and also on the scope, sorry, if you go to this analysis one, this is actually lit up in blue, and that's what this is showing here. That's showing, that icon is showing that I can adjust it here. So if I adjust my dial here, and again I'm clicking on the outside, and when I click on the outside it brings this sort of arrow, double-headed arrow, so I can go anti-clockwise or clockwise. So as I'm driving it clockwise you can see that the time is increasing. As I'm driving it anti-clockwise you can see that the time is decreasing. So let's take it back, say, to 50 milliseconds just for instance for the moment, so it's only just got some persistence mode. We spoke about the intensities before, the waveform, grid and LED brightness. Okay, we'll come back out of that for the moment. You've got all of your controls here are all clickable, so everything that you can see on the screen here basically is clickable. So if I want to, for instance, zoom in, I can either go to my zoom button here and that will take me to my zoom display. I can also change the percentage on the screen here, so that's doing it both on the scope, and you'll see with the little viewer that you've got to the bottom right that it's moving at the same rate that I'm moving this. I can then come out of my zoom either by hitting the zoom button again on the scope, and the zoom button you'll note is actually, I was going to say it's highlighting, but it's not, sorry, correction, because this button is not a highlighted button. You just get a highlight round the button to show that your cursor pointer is over that, so it's not there, it's green there. If I click on that again, I'm out of zoom. But I can also, because I've got it in my shortcuts up here on the left here, because anything left of this icon here, which is your settings icon, these you can set up to whatever you want to set them up to. These are, I think, the defaults at the moment I've got it set to, but if I click on zoom, I'm now back into my zoom mode again, and if I click on it again I can come out of my zoom. I've got my search mode here, which is more to do with searching for rising edges and protocol stuff, which we'll go into a little bit later on, but I click on that again. If I click on this setup one just to show you here, this is the toolbar setup. So for instance, if I don't want search, I can click on search here and that removes my search. It leaves me an empty block that I can either leave empty, or if for instance I wanted to have my auto set button up here, which I don't have at the moment, if I click on that, I've now put my auto set button in. The scope seems to decide the position of these. You can't, although that was on the end there, it's actually put it there, and it doesn't seem to let you can't sort of reposition. It'd be nice if you could click and move them. You can't, but anyway, if I click on my auto set, you'll see that the scope just went into auto set and chose a slightly different time base and a slightly different horizontal value, and it also looks like it's adjusted it back to full bandwidth. So that's why, because I've got a cable, we're getting this ringing on the end there. If I increase the time base, so if I do that, we can see I've just gone to my scale button and I've used my cursor around the edge to increase the time base. You can see the ringing there. That's because when I did the auto set, the scope chose the probably full bandwidth. And if we want to look at that, if I click on my channel button, you'll be able to see down here on bandwidth we're at full. If I click on 20 megahertz, sorry, clicked on invert, correction, sorry. If I click on 20 megahertz, that's got a nice round signal now. If I click back onto the full, I'm getting the ringing, which is obviously just coming from my cable because it's just a very cheap bit of RJ58 cable that I'm using. I'm not using the probe with an adapter just for speed this time. But if we go back and put the bandwidth limit onto 20, that will clean the signal up. If I want to now jump back out of my to my time base, and I want to take my time base wider, I can either use the scale button here by clicking round here. So as I'm moving, it's altering my time base, and let's say we select, say, 200 nanoseconds. If I want to zoom in on the time base and select a smaller time base, so I'm moving in, I'm now at 5 nanoseconds. What is also a pleasure is, I think I'm correct in saying that if I do the undo button, it will take me back one step, a bit like on a word processor. So that's taking me back one step to my previous 40, back to 200. So this, and then I can do a redo 40, 10 nanoseconds. So quite useful. You can actually step backwards and forwards through your stages that you've just selected in the software, which is rather nice. And again, with any of these, you can reset them to whatever you want to set them to. So this is your sort of option here. If, for instance, we wanted FFT up here, we could remove one of these other ones. So if I want to remove auto set, just to show you that, I would click on my auto set to remove it. I click on my FFT, and funny enough, that time it has brought it up at the end. Come out of that. Now if I click on FFT, it's going to take me straight into the FFT of the waveform. Click on it again, it's going to take me out of it. So these shortcut buttons are quite useful. You are limited to these selections, so undo, redo, preset, auto set, save and setup, etc. So there are a few things that I thought here would be really nice. If you could have, for instance, your some of your measurements as a preset. So on my Rigol, I've got the ability to just touch buttons on the left hand side of the screen and come straight into the measure menu. I would love this to be able to have, say, presets here that you could select, say, 3 or 4 standard sort of measurements, maybe frequency, maybe rise, fall times, maybe probably those actually would be rather nice, plus some others to be able to have in here. But unfortunately, they have limited it at the moment to this. If you click set to default, that will actually take you back to the default of the scope, which I think actually is just those 3, those 4, funnily enough. I don't know if I can use the undo to take me back. Just have a look. If I come out of that, let's just have a look if that will do. No, it won't. So if I wanted to reload my others here, I'd put that one in. I'd probably put my preset and auto set, and I'd probably have my zoom up there just quickly so that I've reloaded those again. On this side, we've got mainly things to do with your time base and your triggering, etc. So here we've got the triggering channel. So we're triggering on channel 1 at the moment because I'm feeding the signal into 1. If I click on channel 2, our source button has gone green, which it will have done on the scope as well, showing it's channel 2 that it's trying to source the trigger from, but of course we're not got a channel 2 on and got no signal into it, so it's not going to trigger. If I want to go back to channel 1, I can either click through on my source button, orange, channel 4 the blue, or channel 1 again. Alternatively, I can just select it up here. I've also got an external trigger input which is on the front of the scope, one of the inputs on the front, so I can click on that, and again it's untriggered because we're trying to trigger off an external input, which obviously we're not doing. But you might have a situation where you want to trigger from a waveform coming in, and you want to use the external trigger. So I'll take it back to C1, channel 1, and we're there. Okay, if I move that waveform across slightly and just close this menu, this is the selection of rising, falling, or either, and then the full menu of your trigger menu here. Maybe click on that properly. Yeah, didn't click on it properly. That's our trigger menu. Sometimes, like if you hit the mouse button twice, it comes out of it. But that's more my mouse, I think, as opposed to the software. So here we've got our trigger types here, and if I go to rising edge, you can see that. So that's falling edge, that's rising edge. So that's both. All right, okay. I didn't realise that. If you click on the same one, it actually goes through all of them. So that's rising edge, falling edge, both, which you can see, or back to that. Alternatively, you can just click on either one. So if you the one you want, actually, it's interesting. For some reason, it's taking me one right one stage at a time and then just going, I didn't notice that before. Now that seems to be a slight bug perhaps. If I go here, yeah, never noticed that before. So here I can click on whatever I want and go straight to it, either falling, rising. I can go straight from, say, falling I'm in now, I can go straight to either, or back to rising. But this actually is taking me one stage through at a time, so it's like an arrows left and right. It's not doing what it should do actually, which is a bit strange. But anyway, obviously there's another trigger. Your main trigger input here is your trigger type. So you've got edge, width type, video triggering, pattern, line, timeout. When you go into things like video, not that I particularly use it, you get a further sub menu. So when I clicked on video now, we've now got source game, but we've got standard, so NTS, CCAM, PAL, HDTV, etc. So this menu changes all frames. There's different modes here, odd frames, even frames, etc. Not something that I actually have ever used, so I'm not exactly sure how those settings work. But the main point is that as you click here, you'll see that the signal here will change. If I go onto edge, sorry, I clicked outside of it, let's go to trigger. Sorry, easier to go to my trigger menu by going here and then going to trigger here. Right. If I go back and click on edge again, my options now reflect things to do with edge. If I go to width here, they will reflect things to do with width of the pulse. So we've got the width, right, this is a positive pulse, and you can set the greater than the width, less than width, width equal to a certain amount, not equal to a certain amount, and inside and outside an amount. And then because this blue line, as I mentioned before, has further space down there, I can go up and down with my mouse. This is a touch mouse I'm using, but if I had a wheel it would be the same. I'm moving up and down that menu and expanding it because I've got further options here. Lost my top options at the top and I just go back up to get to those. Obviously that those will change with whatever sort of trigger you're setting. So if we go back, and I want to go to trigger type at the moment, just for this example, to edge. Sorry, let me click on it properly. Go to trigger type, width, edge. I'm back to edge again, and I'll probably move. Yeah, I know what's happened. I've moved my trigger value outside of my waveform, so the trigger is here. If I pull that down, you'll be able to see on the actual scope image and also on this that I'm moving the trigger, and you can see that we're moving. My horizontal trigger is here. I moved that previously, and I can grab that and move it away. We've got this set up for horizontal trigger middle position. If we want to alter that, I go to my horizontal menu here, which is marked horizontal, and I've got reference point middle. I can go left, which sets it over here on the left. I can go middle, which sets it, you can click on it, go middle, which sets it to the middle, or right, which, well, when I get rid of the menu, you'll be able to see it, go back, is over here to the right. Now, if I want to position that, I can got a position to home by zeroing it, which is the center. So this alters my position on the outside. You can see it's got an arrow double-headed again. I can go left and right quite nicely, and it's very fluid. If I want to go straight to that, I can just click on the center, and that's taken me straight to my right edge there. And my triggers now, you can see the trigger at the top there. So if I want to set that to the center point, say for this, I'd go right, middle, and we're there. If I come out of that menu, if for instance I had this moved over for some reason, sorry, I've got my cursors on, I just clicked on cursors. Right. To that. I think I'm in cursors, I'm not sure why. I think I clicked on my cursors there. Just clicked on my cursors, I'll switch the cursors off. Right, that's it. I picked up my trigger point again now, and if I've got it, say there, you can see that it's moving up here, around at this point here, it's showing me I'm 44 nanoseconds. If I move my trigger over this way, I'm negative because I'm now to the right of my trigger point, 40 nanoseconds, which is on this division, and these are 20 nanoseconds a division from here. My center point 0 is on the trigger line here. If I want to go back to center point, I just click on that button, it takes me back to center, so we're back there. I've got I think my offset value here, oh sorry, no, that's my trigger value there. So I'm triggering here at minus 80 millivolts. If I want to say trigger on this signal at say 125 millivolts, I can just put in 125 small m, and you can see that my trigger level's moved up to here, and I think I might have moved it slightly, but it's now 124, probably because I moved it as I went up. But you can see that that's now altering, the value is altering as I'm dragging the trigger up and down. I can also do that again with the trigger level button, that if I move and click on my outside, you can see that the trigger is going up now to the right, gone above the waveform, and it's going left if I move it anti-clockwise. So down the waveform, clockwise up the waveform. If, for instance, I'm right on the top center and it's just struggling to trigger there, and it's getting some trigger jitter, if I click on the center, we should go to 50% of the waveform, and it does. So that's now triggering bang in the center of the waveform on the 0 passing point, because this waveform is, I think, 1 volt peak to peak, which makes sense from around here. It's just between the 4 and the 600, so we're about 500 millivolts positive, 500 millivolts negative. So that shows you your sort of triggering. You've got here your acquisition. So if I click on this box, I get into my acquisition menu, which I can either do by using my acquisition button. So 2 ways of doing that. Clicking on the acquisition button takes me there. I can click on this, or a third way, which is why this scope is so powerful, is when I click on this little rumble or something, I believe they call it. I'm sure that's the correct name for it, but that's the menu button. If I click on that, I get these menus coming up, and again I can use my mouse and sliding up and down. If I then go to my acquisition menu, which is acquire here, I'm back into my acquisition menu here, which I can either go to from clicking here or on the acquisition button, and I've got megasamples here as in the memory length, so I can click on this and I can select automatic if I want to, or I can select 10 kilosamples, 20 kilosamples, 50, 100, 20, 500, 1 megasample, up to 20 megasamples. And these number of history segments are to do with the history option, where you can actually record using this a certain number of waveforms. So if I click on this, for instance, and set this up using this analysis button over on the right here, let's just say I set that up to 6. I think what we can do is, if I put it into single, I think we will actually have acquired 6 waveforms. And if I go into history now, and I haven't used my history for a while, but let's just check I'm right. If I go into history now, I think when I bring this up, yes, we've got 6 triggers that it took. Because I put 6 in for the NX single into 6, I asked the scope to record 6 waveforms, and they're going to look identical as it happens, but you can see that it's recorded here going from the first point back to 5, so there's 6 in total, and I'm clicking through them now. They look identical. You can just see some change on the waveform, but it's so minor, because obviously, but this would be particularly relevant if you were trying to capture digital signals, because you set your trigger up and you could then set up 30, 50, whatever, depending upon your memory length, for the actual signal, so you could capture them. So the history function, which is an option on the scope, is a very powerful option. In actual fact, over here we can actually play that, and this is a similar sort of thing to the Rigol, has a sort of history mode but has a physical dial for that. But this is quite powerful actually once you get used to it, particularly with decodes. If we want to put repeat, we can actually put repeat on, put the run, and that's now running through all my waveforms, but you can only just see this changing, because really this wasn't, this waveform was pretty constant. You can also alter the speed of this, so slow, fast, and I think this is an automatic setting. I think there's 3 settings and an A, but I'm not actually sure what the automatic does, because I don't think I've been able to find that. I think it might be something to do with the rate at which it recorded it. Actually, that doesn't make sense. I'm not sure exactly what that does, to be honest with you, but you've got 3 different speeds there. If you want to go through them, and you say you wanted to have a long list and you wanted to look through data, for instance, it would be quite useful, because you'd be able to alter the speed, go medium speed, or you can go very fast as well. Actually, that's slow for some reason, not sure why it's doing that. But anyway, that's quite useful, this whole setting. You can also save, if I had a memory stick in, you can save the waveforms here that you've captured. And there's also an option to do relative time. So these are the times, the difference in time between each capture, or you can do absolute time, which actually I think records the actual physical time that's on the scope itself, all the way down to about 6 or 7 positions, 7 positions past the decimal point. That's quite impressive. If I want to get rid of this segment table, either I can alter the amount that it's as per all the other ways of dragging it up and down, or I can just click on it and it closes it down. Coming back up here again, as we're working through this way, we've got Timebase here, which I think I went through before. Actually, we're on run stop, so let me just start the scope again. So I'm running now. We've got the Timebase there, and I can just click on the Timebase I want. If I want to go back to a smaller time, I'm using my mouse now, and you can see that we're now at 50 milliseconds, so we're getting a very wide time base there. If we go back, I can either enter the value here, or I can just click on it, say at 5 milliseconds. Still not going to give me anything that I want. Let's go back to some nanoseconds. Let's go back to 500 nanoseconds. That makes more sense. You can see the waveform at 500 nanoseconds now. This is my horizontal position, and that's my deviation from the horizontal. I'm at 0 at the moment. So if I want to move my trigger 500 nanoseconds to the left, I would do 500 minus, I think it is, nanoseconds. And sorry, it should have been minuses to the right. It should have been a positive value, because it's now put my trigger, actually it is right, no, 500, then the actual trigger point is now set to the horizontal position of the scope's center trigger position is 500. We've moved the trigger over to the right, but in actual fact the trigger position is 500 nanoseconds to behind us, so that's why that's over on the left. A bit of a strange way of thinking about it perhaps, but it's just the way that that's sorted. The mode here, that allows us to run and stop, so that's a sort of another way of doing run stop. So you can either do it on the scope with the run stop button, click on this particular run stop button that changes from red to green, and that'll be doing the same on the scope, as you can see. And also I can do it here, run or break. Actually probably should be stop, but they're showing it as break. Sample mode, this again I think I mentioned in one of the other videos, this is our acquisition mode. So we're in the normal sampling mode, we've got peak detect mode, high resolution, that's got a sort of boxcar averaging I believe, the average mode, envelope mode, which as I said previously gives you this rather nice envelope of the waveform, and you've got envelope with peak detect. Remember in the previous video I was showing this peak detect being able to select anomalies on the waveform that I was producing from the Keysight scope. But it's rather nice again that you don't have to, you can just one click away to change. So if you're looking at a signal and you want to go straight into high resolution mode because you want to look at the signal in more detail, you just click on it, click on high resolution, and you're there. I think that when I clicked before, oh, I think I clicked on that. I think I must have clicked, I think my Timebase moved, actually my horizontal position moved because of the way I clicked by accident. But that's your high res position, sorry, that is your position for selecting rather your sampling method, which is rather nice, and it's just one click away. You can also go into your full menu there by clicking on menu at the bottom, and we're into the record length, the acquire mode, number of samples. Let's put that back down. So if I want to put that down to 1 again, so when I hit my single button it just takes 1 acquisition instead of taking the number that I've entered here, I can just enter it here. And by the way, the numbers here will change. So we've only got 32 maximum samples here in single because of the record length. So if I get 5 megasamples, if I go say to 1 megasample memory length and I now click on my singles button, my menu is now showing me between 1 and 159 because we've got more, because we can get more acquisitions because our memory is reduced per acquisition. So we've got about 160 meg of memory in this scope total, hence we can take basically 159 acquisitions. But of course, if we make this 10, then we've got, sorry, make this 10, on 10, and then we'll be able to do 16 here, because obviously 10 times 16 is 160. It's back to the same total memory utilization. You can also have that on automatic. So for instance, Keysight and some of the other scopes have an automatic mode, so they'll just choose their what they consider the best. In actual fact, on the Keysight scope I've got, you can't actually choose your memory length at all. It just uses the maximum all the time, which sometimes actually can be a bit annoying. Go back to single. Let's just reset that to minimum 1, so it just captures once if I hit my single button. The interpolation here is sin X on X, linear mode, and sample and hold. You probably won't be able to see it on this particular waveform, and it also sort of shows you what the sin X on X is doing with the data points there. If I do linear, it'll show me again, and if I do sample and hold, if I want more detailed explanation, I can actually click on help, and it gives me the help of the last thing that I was looking at. So here it's brought up our help menu that we can move around, and it's got our details for this interpolation mode, sin X on X, and what it can do, the linear and the sample and hold. And I think you'll find that if you click on the record length and then click on help, yes, it does the same thing. So now it's come up with record length. It requires signals with either automatic or selective record length. So it's telling you here when you click on the help what the last thing you selected does, which can, or in most cases tells you, and can be quite useful. You've got roll mode here, which is a standard roll mode for the scope. I think we've been through most of these. Coming back down to these on the software again, everything you can do on buttons over here you can also do over here. So when I click on my C1 here, this is my channel 1 button, it's bringing up my channel menu, so I can ground my channel. So that's now grounded, so I'm not seeing my signal anymore. I can take my ground off, I can go AC and DC coupled. I can set my probe attenuation, which brings my probe menu up, and it's got set ones here, which are quite nice actually. So I've got 1 to 1, 10 to 1, 100 and 1000 to 1, which you might say have if you're using a current probe. And for instance here you've got your volts and amps, so you can see that's 800 millivolts negative. You can actually have 800 milliamps negative, so you can alter this for whether you're using a voltage probe or an amperage probe, current probe, sorry. And you've got here, at the moment this is showing me as 1 to 1 down in this corner, bandwidth limit, DC coupled 1 to 1. If I click on say 10 to 1, you'll see my voltage is now wrong because we've scaled up because I'm using the cable. So it's showing the wrong voltage reading here, but what it's also doing here is showing me that this is at 10 to 1. If I want to go back to 1 to 1 for the cable I'm using, I do that, and we've gone from 200 millivolts back to 200 millivolts, whereas if we go 10 times that, it'll read at 2 volts, obviously, in the normal way any scope would. You can also use this to enter it to whatever you want. I think you can put in any value you want to a few decimal points. To 2 decimal points, I think it rounds it up, but that's quite useful. So you can go 1.24, so you can enter here whatever you want. So if you've got something where you want 3.33 as a ratio of 1 to 3.33, say for instance with a particular current probe, you can enter it, and we've now got 3.33 to 1. So that's very flexible in what you can do that. And again, with this you can either do it on a menu or using this over here, and you can see that that's moving that up. A bit long-winded because you've got to go through a lot of numbers to do that, so probably easier just to either click on the base selection here, which is generally pretty straightforward, so 1 to 1, and we're now back at 1 to 1. We'll come out of that, back. So those are, and each of these are your probe settings, channel settings and probe settings. So this is the 200 millivolts, vertical sensitivity, bandwidth limited, DC coupled with 1 to 1. It's nice that you can see it all in one go, and you'd see the same if I switch on channel 2 here. Green light will come on the scope. It's come on here. These buttons have gone green to say that I'm now working with this green channel. So if I move my position, you can see I'm moving my offset position on that. I can click it for the center if I want to center it. Here I can click, and I'm now back into my green menu. I can go full on the green, so that I've got all my options again for channel 2, and it tells me here I'm on channel 2 with all of my AC/DC coupling, my grounding that I can do, my bandwidth limit. And when I go bandwidth limit, you can see that it's got BW here for bandwidth. If I go full, that drops off the display there back to 20, and it's telling me that's bandwidth limited. I can invert my signal, I can set my vertical scale here. So if I want to, click here, I'm on 1 volt per division, but if, say, I wanted to be on, say, 300 millivolts, I do 300 M, and I'm now 300 millivolts a division there. Got my offset that I can set here. I've got my deskew if I've got different lengths of cable and I want to deskew my signal. 0 offset and waveform color, which I think I've shown in the first video that you can change. So that at the moment is default green. I can go, sorry, I didn't click on it properly, rainbow, fire, temperature. So I can alter my colors for each individual channel, which is quite nice actually. And you've got probe attenuation here, which we looked at that menu before. To switch that off, I can either click on this twice, or I can click down here on the 2 and click on the off, which is what I tend to do. If I want to click on this bandwidth here, I can click straight on the B bandwidth there, go to menu, and then click on full, and you'll see now I'm back at full, so I've got the BW gone, and we've got this little ringing again, which if I click on 20 megahertz, the ringing is going to disappear. Okay. The generator has its own menu down here again, which is quite useful. So instead of going into my generator here, because I'm using the internal generator to generate that, I can also click on it here to bring up my generator menu, but I can also go straight into my generator here. And this is telling me it's a square wave, 1 volt peak to peak, 1 megahertz high Z, which is quite nice. So I can actually click on this, go to menu, I can alter it here. So if I want a sine wave, I can go sine, sync, C wave, pulse, triangle, ramp, arbitrary, exponential. It's a little bit annoying. Sometimes this disappears like for that, and I don't think there's a way of changing. On the Rigol, you can actually change how long your menu stays up. I'm not sure you can do that on the Keysight from memory, but definitely on the Rigol you can have a fixed amount of time, or that they stay up forever until you close them. I'm not sure there's a way of altering it on this, which I find quite annoying actually, because sometimes I'm thinking about something and the menu's disappeared, so then you've got to click again, like for instance there, whereas really if I'm inside a menu like that, it would be nice to stay. I can either use my mouse again to go up and down, or I can just click on what I want. So if I want sine, I clicked on sine, click outside. Sorry. Bring it outside, it's actually safer to wait, because if you click badly, my mouse is a touch mouse, it's going to change something else. Got the frequency here, and again I can either click on it to enter it here. So if I want to enter 2 megahertz, I've done that straight away. I can type in an exact frequency that's a real pleasure. So I want to go into say 1.33333 megahertz. I'm there. I want to type in 300 kilohertz. I'm at 300 kilohertz. I can also, because this is blue arrow here, go to my rotary here, and I can go around that, and you can see that that's bringing that down. So yeah, so reducing the frequency, or I can increase the frequency by going the other way. But I tend to, if I'm using the function generator, I would tend to basically just either, actually not either, I would tend to, sorry, just select it. So if I want 1 megahertz, I go 1 megahertz, and we're back to 1 megahertz. Same with the amplitude, you can do exactly the same. You can wind it up here. So if I do that, you can see my signal. 1 second, let's close that menu. You can see that we're on the blue thing again, so I can go round. I'm going lower, so my waveform's reducing in size. I can go clockwise to make it go larger. So, but again, normally I would just click on it. Maybe I want a 1.25 volt peak to peak sine wave. Just enter. I'm now 1.25 volts peak to peak. I can enter my noise here. That's rather nice as well. So this generator is very well. Got a lot of functions to it. So if I want to put on, say, this is between 0 and 100%, which is actually too much, but if, say, I want 20% noise on this waveform and I go enter, you'll now see that this noise is on the waveform, and we've got a 20% noise. Quite useful if you want to induce a signal and tester systems to see how it affects with noise, and of course you could bring that noise on a square wave. So if we just go to rectangle, it still remember my settings, so that's sitting at the top there, and you can see, and it's a very nice sort of display on this. Even on the web browser, you've got a real sort of display that shows the graduation. So I was looking for the correct word. If I want to change the intensity on the screen, I click on that. Yeah, twice, sorry. Go to that, my waveform intensity. I can either enter it here or I can use this button, and I hope I'm right that when I bring that down, yes, it's even updating straight away on the web browser, which is quite something. There's virtually no lag on this, which I find tremendous. So if I'm going like that, you can see I'm bringing that up, my 62%, 73, I can bring that right up, and you can see now 100%, I'm getting that's a bit blocky and I'm not seeing the noise as easily, whereas if I bring this down a bit, I can bring it down to more like an analog display. Sorry, not so easily, but it's more like an analog. So if I bring this down to say 60%, something like that, 61%, you can see it's got a bit more like an analog display here. And if I want to zoom in on that, I can alter my scale. I can then move my waveform across, obviously, and you can see the noise here. And if we went into the generator again, I can either do it here, menu, noise. I can either enter my noise here or dial it up on the dial. So if I wanted to see a bit more noise and say 33%, you'll see that noise has risen there. Very analog-like, rather nice. If I go back to a sine wave, say, we'll see that noise on the sine wave, and the sine wave now is looking very analog-like because of the thinner waveform. So if we want to see that intensity up, I just click on that. Waveform intensity is highlighted. I can bring it up that way, say 75%, and I'm there. And that's and the update is so quick that you're seeing that updating on the screen almost as quickly as you're seeing on the scope, which I think is really very impressive. I've never seen software like this that just doesn't really ever have a flaw in it. You can see I can move my trigger point. You can see my waveform is moving up and down virtually instantly. There's no lag between what I'm seeing on my computer screen and what I'm seeing on my scope. It's very impressive again. Okay, let's get rid of that noise just to bring that back down. And if I want to get rid of that noise, I go into the generator, which I can do on this one. Say, for instance, noise. Click on that. I can go minimum to 0, and we've now got a clean waveform again. We've also got sweep mode on this, so you've got a sweep generator on this. So if we go sweep, I can set this to say from 100 kilohertz all the way through to say 3 megahertz. Now that is just trying to work out why that's not showing me that properly. Where's my trigger point? Hold on, let's just see if my trigger point. It's a linear sweep. I'll probably, sorry, I've swept it from the wrong thing, so let's hold on a second. Let's just do this a bit more logically. If, say, I put a 500 kilohertz square wave, and then I put my sweep generator, clicked on the wrong thing. If I then put my sweep here from say 300 kilohertz, it's my sweep time I think also was too small. 300 kilohertz to say 1 megahertz, and let's say that that takes 5 seconds, and then put that on. Let's just see. Yeah, that looks right now. Need to come out on my Timebase, otherwise I can't see it. Yeah, you can see it now, and that's a sweep set up. I was sweeping too quickly before in one second, so it wasn't displaying it properly. But that you can see now, it's changing its frequency. So we're going on this sweep, and again it tells you all the details here. So you've got a square wave, 1.25 volts peak to peak, high Z, and it's on sweep mode. You obviously can't see the exact sweep because I haven't got enough space there, but if you go into menu, you can see just by clicking that our sweep was from 300 kilohertz to 1 megahertz, and obviously we could set this time. I think we can go up to 10 seconds actually is your maximum, so if you go to 10 seconds it's obviously slower now, and obviously you can set these to whatever you want. And you've got linear and logarithmic sweep as well, so which is rather useful. You've also got modulation, which I won't go into now, but you can modulate these signals, and I think you've got AM, FM, FSK and ASK modulation, and you can change the function that you're modulating with, whether it be sine, rectangle, triangle or ramp. Let's switch off the sweep for the moment, so we'll switch sweep off, and we're back to the 300 kilohertz square wave there, which we've got there. Okay, that shows most of the generator functions. So you, across the bottom here, you've got your channels or your generator. You've also got your, I haven't got the logic probe plugged in, but if we had the logic probe plugged in, it's telling me please connect the logic probes. We'd also get a logic probe menu down here, which would be quite useful, but we obviously haven't got those plugged in, and I'll show that at a later stage. So I've gone through the zoom, the horizontal and the acquisition. I've shown the channels. The logic I showed previously. The reference is the reference waveforms, which I think I also showed previously about copying waveforms. So source 1, reference 1. If we put this to say reference 2 and we say copy, if I now switch off channel 1, this waveform here that I'm moving is R2. I've also got R1 switched on that I had from previous, so let's just bring that in. Let's put state off, yeah. So this is R. That's still my reference 1 waveform, not sure why I did that. State R1. Oh, I switched off the wrong one, sorry. R1 is on, so let's switch R1 off. Let's do R2 and switch it on. And that was the copy of the waveform I just took, which is a 300 kilohertz, sorry, 1.25 square wave. It was the copy of the waveform. And you can switch on and off. You've got 4 memory positions, I think, for your references, for your waveforms here. Yeah, you've got R1 to R4, so you can store different reference waveforms. You can also load them up. So if you've got them in memory, if I click on load, these are some others that were saved internally previously. You can also delete them. So if I want to delete one, this is showing my internal memory. I can just go delete file. Do I really want to do it? Yes, it's gone there. I can delete that. Delete file. Yeah, auto save, delete. And we've deleted them. If I click on that, I close that down. And I think I can save my reference waveform. So if I call this reference 1 and I call it example, yeah. I'm typing wrong, must be getting tired. Let's just call it that. I know it's tilde X, it's a bit of an odd name, but anyway, let's just do that. So it's reference 01 example, enter, and I go save. I think it'll save it. R2 saved, okay. So that's saved it internally, so we've saved it to the internal memory of the scope. If I now go to load reference waveforms, you can actually see that reference waveform is there. So if, for instance, I switch off this R2 waveform by going there, then I go to reference, switch it off. But if I now go to menu and I go to load reference and double click on this, it's come up straight with, although obviously it's the same one in memory, it's loaded that straight back again from its own memory. So you can store your reference waveforms, etc. And of course those could be signals that you've brought not just from the function generator, they could be even digital signals that you've captured on the scope and then saved, and then manipulated, which can be quite useful. Okay, so that's the reference mode. Switch it off, and then the maths mode here is the different channels and the operator that you can do with them: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. I'd like to see a few more here, but this is the standard sort of maths mode that you get on some of the scopes, and you can switch it on and off here. So at the moment I'm showing C1 plus C2, which of course is my square wave that's there, but C2 doesn't have anything on it. Switch that off. Switch off channel 2. Switch back channel 1 for that. Okay, obviously I've shown the cursors before. Again, you can alter everything from this menu again, and your types are horizontal, your vertical cursors, vertical and horizontal, so you've got both, and V markers, which is quite nice. So you've now got, off the screen, let's bring our cursors back in. So I think I need to go cursor, set to trace. Right, sorry, I had them off the screen from previously. So now you can see my little cross there. So it's staying on the waveform. As I'm moving it, it's tracing the waveform. So it's literally at that point there, it's at the top corner. And my number 2, if I click on that line, I've highlighted it here. I can either move it with this button again. See, that's moving. Going down, so if we go down, up, and back down again, that should give me, just before I go down, not the easiest. I actually tend to drag them along. It's just easier, to be honest with you, than on that button there. And these I normally use the touch screen. That's not that there. We're actually there now, and you can see there that we've got a delta there, delta in time. So it's giving us a delta of 1.963 microseconds, or almost 2 microseconds there. And you've got your T1 position in time before the trigger. You've got your voltage level for your position there, so it's 620 millivolts. And again, the T2 time and the voltage level on the T2 of 623, 624, so it's moving slightly. But you've got all your details for your cursor there, so let's come out of that. You've got your quick measure, which I think I've shown before again, which gives you the rise and fall times, the mean cycle, I think the frequency. Yes, sorry, it gives you it down here, the frequency. So you've got your measurements on the waveform here and your frequency down here. So 500 kilohertz, which was obviously what this wave was, which we're seeing here. And it's a 1.27. I've got 1.25, so it's pretty close to what we set. Again, I'm just using a very rough piece of coax, so I'm getting noise on the waveform, which is why it's reading that. And again, the RMS cycle of that, and that will change slightly. If we go to peak detect, you'll see that that's gone up slightly because we're detecting the peak, so that the voltage is now reading slightly higher. Whereas if we're on high res, it'll probably come down very slightly. And probably the same with these. You'll see these change if I'm on sample. Not easy to see, but you'll see 633. If I go to peak detect, 635, it's moving a little bit because of the noise on the waveform, the natural noise. Okay, so that's the quick measure. Click that off again, and we're back to the normal signal. We mentioned protocol. The measure is obviously our standard measurements, which I've shown previously. So we can say we want to measure, for instance, the rise time. So we go horizontal, we go rise time, and that's the rise time down there. On source 1, if we want stats on, we can actually click on statistics, and now, which is quite nice, we pull this up, you've got your normal measures here. If you click on the statistics tab, you've got your rise time, current, minimum, max, mean, standard deviation, and wave count. And then this one is on channel 3. We already got another measurement put in, which is the pulse width positive from previously, but obviously there's nothing on channel 3. If you want to change that, you can actually go to C3. I think if I go to pulse width there, it's showing me on source C3. If I go on to source, I can change my source now to C1. So you can click on it properly. So I'm now getting my pulse width of 1 microsecond, which makes absolute sense, and the minimum, max, and mean and standard deviations in picoseconds and my wave count here. I can also reset my stats by doing this. So if I click on this, wave count goes down. You can see the update of the information, and you can also got the save here, so I can tell it where I want to save it to the USB on the front stats. It's not highlighted save because I've got no USB stuck in there at the moment, unfortunately. Okay, we'll come out of that. And again, with this, you can adjust. So if you've got a large number of measurements here, or 4 measurements, you can adjust your display relative to the number you've got, which is quite nice. When I say if there's only one you want, you can do that, so you get your maximum of your waveform. You can click back to your measure, or you can just click into your statistics. So they're like sort of tabs. I don't think, again, that you can bring these over, not that it's particularly necessary. Might be nice if you could order these by just bringing it over, but you can't. But I can just click on that, Only thing I have noticed, which would be nice, clicked on that to switch it off, which is a bit silly. If I go back to stats again. So what I have noticed, which would be nice, I've switched off the other one, but it doesn't matter, is if it remembered the amount per the screen height. So if I'm on here and I set that my measure, I've got one item. If I go to stats, if I had to, it should really remember my last. So if I do that, I now go back to measure, it's actually using the last height that you set up. So it's using the height you set up now, not what was there. So if my stats, I set my stats mode to that, that's fine. But if I go into measure mode, and let's say I had making this smaller because I want more of the screen, if I now go back to my stats, I'm actually going to be at the same width. So it's using whatever you set it to manually. It's not, which was the last thing obviously, it's not actually capturing the actual amount of screen here, vertical position here, with your actual setting here, which is a bit of a shame actually. It's not a major issue by any means, but it just would be nice. But maybe these sort of things they could alter in software updates, because it would be so easy for the software to know that I've set this amount of screen real estate with my stats, and when I click on my measure it went to a different one, like you'd get on a Windows or a Mac on a web browser sort of thing. It just would be nice if that did that, but unfortunately it doesn't. If I want to close these, I can either close them from my menus over here, or I can just simply click on them and it closes, which is rather nice. That's the brightness button we looked at before. Quick measure. Search we spoke about briefly, which I will go into in detail, but you can search on edge widths, pulse widths, peaks, rise and fall times, rump pulses, and then it brings up these markers. So we're searching now, for instance, on an edge. The setup of that edge is a positive, sorry, is it? No, it's not, sorry. It's clicked on the wrong one. We're setting up on an edge here, so it's looking for an edge here, and with the edge here you've got, this is showing, these marks here are showing your edge, which is very similar to what the Keysight does actually with its search facility. And if I switch that off, they'll disappear. But this can also be used, I think, for searching on data or pattern data, which is really very powerful. So this now is using digital signals from your logic channels at the base. So you've got D0 to D7 and D8 to D15, 16 channels, and your analog, and you can set these up to high, low, or don't care, an X, which is a sort of, you know, which like low or high. You can also set up on these whether these are just AND, ORs, NANDs or NORs, and you can set up pulse widths and greater than, smaller than, etc., which can be very nice. It needs a bit of explanation, which I will try and demonstrate, but if you're working with digital signals, particularly AND and OR gates and things of that nature, or FPGAs, this can be quite useful to set something up here to check something that you want to produce on a board. So it's quite a powerful, this pattern thing gives you a lot of options, but it needs a fair bit of explanation as to how that works. So if we come out on that, FFT obviously we've looked at before. I'm going to do a video showing the whole FFT. It's just too in-depth to show at this stage, but I intend to show this FFT on this. Has got a very nice display. Let's just get rid of these to show that. This I've got a relative bandwidth. We're set up too far, so we're going at the moment from 600 kilohertz to 20 megahertz. If we did a stop of say 2 megahertz, my span is wrong there. You can actually adjust your start, your stop and your center frequency. You can also adjust by clicking here the type of FFT it is with regards to whether it's flat top, Hamming, Blackman and rectangular, just by clicking on that. But I will go into this. You've got dBm, dBVs. I think on the waveform you've got minimum hold, maximum hold, averaging. It's quite a powerful, and the FFT works very nicely on this, but I will do a proper video displaying a demonstration of the FFT, but that's a real video in itself virtually. And what I may do is I may show it against my Rigol. I've got a Rigol DS815 spectrum analyzer, so it'd be interesting to actually see that against a spectrum analyzer. And again, the real beauty of this one, unlike most scopes that superimpose it on the top of the signal, you can alter this so you can have virtually no top signal on all your FFT, or you can just bring it to wherever you want, midpoint, or have a small FFT like that and a large signal, and these you can put cursors and measure. It is very powerful, but I'll go through that in due course. Switch that off by clicking on the FFT, and the FFT is off. The action buttons that I went through before work the same on this software as it does on the scope. Touch lock allows you to stop working your touch, so anything I click on now won't work, and I think, oh, actually the channels will switch on. Right, it looks like they've set that up, and I wasn't sure about that. It looks like, yeah, it is. It's set up for anything in the screen area. So basically any of your touch on the screen now has gone off because I put touch lock on, but all my buttons over here still work, which is quite nice. You've obviously got a clear screen, which is just a normal one for persistence. You've got your presets, which you can set up a certain setup of the scope. I believe I haven't actually done that, but I will look at that. Auto set, which we've used before, just click it and it will do an auto set. We were virtually there, so it's quick. Save load, which you can use for saving setups, references, waveforms, screenshots. And one touch, which I mentioned before, is this action button. So your one touch is set up here for a screenshot. I close that. My one touch button is my camera button. Now if I click on my camera button, it's got an error because I believe medium not available. It's trying again to save it to my USB stick, which I don't have in there, so consequently it gives me an error. Back at the top here you've got your run stop button, your single capture, so it captures a single waveform, put it back up to run. Force trigger if you want to force the scope to trigger. Auto normal, which is the standard where in auto mode it will self trigger if it doesn't detect a signal, whereas in normal mode it will trigger only when it's found a trigger point, I believe. So that's doing auto at the moment. So when it's not illuminated, it's in auto. You can see that it's self-triggering, but it's not getting it right. If I pull my trigger point in, it's there. Or if I'm on normal, it will only trigger when I remove the waveform. I thought it was strange that it still had the waveform. I thought that would disappear, and I thought it was wrong. But in actual fact, reading the instructions, it actually remembers the last acquisition and kept it at that. So it was triggered when I took it above that, so it's now remembered the last. If I clear the screen now, you won't see anything. If I bring my trigger level back in, we're triggered again. So that was correct. I suddenly thought they'd written that wrongly, but in actual fact, on normal, it remembers your last trigger when you remove your trigger level above your signal to untrigger it effectively, which is quite nice. And obviously you've got a trigger light here, so if I move this up here, it's not going to show me that it's triggered, but it still remembers my last one. Clear the screen so we won't see that. So the trigger is off. If I pull that, if you watch that trigger light, as I pull that down, the trigger light shows that we're triggered now, and which is quite useful. Single button, which we've been through before, the levels, which just gives you 50%, so if I put that to there and click my button in the centre, so the outside edge is moving my trigger level anti-clockwise and clockwise, so we put it right at the base there. If I want the middle position, I just click on it and we're back to centre. Trigger is your trigger menu, which we've been through before in some detail. Click away again. Source is colour coded, which is really nice. So for instance, if you've got the green channel on, that's now triggering on green channel number 2, orange 3, blue 4. And the reason I think you can do the colour here, even though the channel's not on, because I once thought that was strange that you could select a channel for your source. Maybe it should only go to the colours if I've only got yellow 1 and 2 on. It should only go 1 and 2 and cycle back. But I believe, and I will confirm this, I'm pretty sure I could actually trigger when the channel's not actually on, so it's still reading from the last setup as such, but you don't have to have the display on, which I proved on a protocol before when I did on one of my last videos. I will check that out, but effectively what I'm saying is it would still be looking for a trigger signal from the blue channel. So if I had a splitter on this and I was sending our generator signal not just into 1 but into 3, I could set up 3 for the correct trigger signal, let's say the correct voltage, and select it here, and we'd actually be triggering off that, although we weren't displaying the waveform. It might just look odd, but I think that's the way it works. So if I want to go back to my trigger here, I can either click through this number of times or just click on my channel here and tell it I want to trigger on 1. I'm straight there. Obviously got channel 2 on, I can switch it off from here, or as I mentioned before, click on that, and I'm gone. And that's our source, auto norm we just discussed. And I think that's really it for the software. You've also got on this software, if we go back to the main menu, and then I'm going to call it a day for this, because this short video has become quite a long video again, but you've got screenshots. So this will go, and this is now taking a screenshot capture of the screen, which you can save, and you can select the format BMP or PNG file, the auto refresh rate, the colour mode, whether you've got grayscale, so I think you can actually set it to grey, so when it screen captures it will go grey, which is rather nice. And you can update it, so I can click it to do an update. I'm telling it to refresh every 10 seconds, so it's actually refreshing and screen capturing every 10 seconds, which is really nice. And I can print this if I want to. If I go to print, it just bring up my normal print menu, I believe, on that. Actually, I've got a printer on, so it won't, but I believe that will send it to a printer. I'm quite sure why it didn't bring up my print thing, but I've not tried that before. Let's go back again. Right, back to there. I've got save and recall, which I believe is to do with saving signals from the scope straight into memory, and that's our page for selecting what we're saving. Network settings, which gives us our network settings that won't alter because I'll lose this page. Passwords. Live screen was rather nice, particularly if you're using a projector, and this gives you an output directly of the screen. I can't alter it though, so it's not as though a live screen with where I can click on anything. It's just producing, so if you were using this for demonstration purposes, you could use this signal straight out to a projector, LCD projector, or another screen, etc. But rather nice. Go back, if I take it back on my back menu button, and then back to the remote front panel, which is where we started and I showed. So that really gives you an idea of the scope software, which I found, given that it's software, and most software, lab software I've got that runs off a PC or a Mac, I never bother to use because I just think it's pretty poor. The only software I do tend to use, I've got a main Nuo DC load, which actually has got some rather, and the power supply, which actually has got some rather nice software, but even that is a bit laggy. This software is the best of any software I've seen. It just works, which is a pleasure. But anyway, that gives you a fairly good in-depth look at the software, which is all free because the network is built into the scope. The software is literally just a matter of setting up your protocol in terms of whether you want it to be a DHCP server, so it does it automatically if you've got your home network or your lab network, office network to do that, or if you want to set it manually, which I do on mine, I just put in the IP address, I put in the router address, the subnet mask, so you can set it up very easily. And as I said, on this, I'm using this with the Netgear little booster, the EX2700 Wi-Fi, sorry, not booster, it's actually, well, it's a booster actually, it's a booster and an access point, and that's running at 300 megabits per second, I believe, and this is so fast, this software, and I don't think whenever I've been using this software, which I've used it a fair amount, not probably maybe 15% of the time, 20% of the time, but I don't think I've ever had this crash yet. It just works again, so from that point of view, it is really impressive. But anyway, that's a short video that's not been short because I think it's 1 hour 15 minutes. But I hope everybody's enjoyed that, and I'm going to be back within about a week's time, probably to look at decodes again and a bit more in depth into decodes. What I'm planning to do is probably to do a video a week, hopefully, on the scope and go through some basic stuff and also go through some more complicated stuff as well, so that I could really get to sort of an in-depth review of the scope, and also I'm getting to learn and use it more myself. It's sometimes a little bit funny. I went this week and I was doing something using the Rigol, and it was strange. I went and touched the Rigol screen and thought to myself, why is the waveform not moving? And once you've started to get used to touchscreens, I know everybody thought initially all touchscreen scopes, they're a gimmick, but some of the operating systems on the touchscreen scopes are just very fluid and very easy once you get used to them, and it's quite funny. I did that, and I also did the same thing on, I've got a Rigol function generator that I went to touch the screen on to adjust one of the settings, and then again remembered that it's not a touch screen. So but my point is that the touch screen works very nicely on this RTB2004, and this software, again, as I said, it just works fluidly. I'm really impressed with it. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll be back shortly for another video, hopefully within a week. Hope you've enjoyed that. Bye for now.